Hello. One of the holy grails in illustration is being able to do perspective drawings. It's difficult, especially if you're doing it by hand, and whenever you have to redraw, it's pretty time consuming. Now, there's a whole different subject that I'm going to just gloss over, and that's talking about how to set up a perspective. What is the appropriate perspective to draw in? There's actually a rendering process where you take a architectural drawing and you take the points or the sides of the drawing and bring it down into a plane and draw it out. But I'm going to gloss over that right now and just talk about the perspective tool that was introduced in CS5, because I think for what you're probably going to do in Illustrator, rather than using a 3D program or a CAD program, it's probably going to just be to get particular Illustrator effects, or kind of 3D-like effects without having true 3D. So I'm going to just kind of gloss over some of this, but let's take a look. I've shown the perspective grid just by choosing it here in the toolbox. And when you get that, you can do some adjustments. Notice that you can adjust how far apart the distance of the vanishing points are. We're working with a 2-point perspective here. And all that means is that there's 2 vanishing points. There's one on each side. So imagine looking at the corner of a building and watching it diminish into space. When you're drawing stuff, typically, to make it look real in perspective, you have to have the parallel lines of the object, or the parallel parts of the object, actually get smaller as they go back into space. And what they do in perspective is they go towards a vanishing point. With a 2-point perspective, they go towards 2 different sides. So again, just imagine this is one side of a building and this is another side of the building. All the lines in that building are going to go towards these points. So with the perspective tool here, I can adjust where those vanishing points are. The farther apart they are, the more it's like a kind of a zoom lens rather than a wide angle lens. If I were to grab these and move them real close to one another, this would be kind of like a wide angle lens instead. So that's a good point. You can consider that you don't always have to go with the default grid. And then obviously you can move the thing up or down too. There's some handles here for adjusting where the grid starts and stops. If you put it down towards the ground, now we're looking at this. Imagine this is eye level. So the further down it is towards the ground, the more the bottom stuff is going to be at eye level, and as we go up, it gets more and more distorted. So imagine if we're doing a building or something like that, you might design it so that you've got the eye level or the horizon line really low. Obviously, you could set it up as well so that you're looking more down on the building, and that's where you would raise the line up and set it there. You can also grab some of these different points and drag them around too. If we need to set up multiple building edges, we could do that. So this would be one edge, and then maybe another edge of another building going down, another edge of a building going down. All of those edges should vanish into these vanishing points. So that's kind of what these different controls are for. If I want to just get them all aligned, I can drag them back over and just line them up on this guy. If you go under the View menu, there's multiple grids that you can choose from. So if I just choose 2P normal view, it sets it back to where it was before. So if you ever get too screwed up, you can always go back to that. And then there's also a 1-point perspective, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, and 3-point perspective. Imagine 3-point being where you actually have multiple vanishing points, not only on either side, but either going up in space or down in space. So those are the different grids. 3-point is probably the closest to being realistic, but in most cases you'll probably just use 2-point. Pardon me, I'm trying to find the grid here again. We'll come back and we'll just do 2p normal view. Okay, so that's a quick breakdown of the grid. If you want to make items and put them onto the grid, you can choose the item. We'll just draw out just a plain old rectangle here. And as I draw it, notice what it's wanting to do is it's wanting to put the rectangle on whatever's selected here on the plane. If I press Command Z, I can choose one of these other planes. If I drag out a rectangle now, notice it snaps to those lines of the rectangle. So I can drag other rectangles. Now notice I was going to put it on this side of the building, but that didn't work because I have to come over and choose that side of the grid first. There we go. And now we've got that in here. If I do something like hold down Command and Option to drag this, notice that it naturally diminishes into space. And I can press Command D just like you do other times, and you get this nice diminishing space. So that's pretty cool. Lots of fun things that you can do just with items, just drawing right on top of the grid. What I want to do though is I want to show you, I've built a couple of items here, and I'm going to take these and place them onto the grid. And we're going to talk about some of the things that you might run into with that. So first thing I did is I built this little building facade. And before we talk about putting it actually on the perspective grid, there's things that I'm doing to make this building, and I think it warrants discussing that too. Probably the biggest is that I have a pattern being used as a fill for this box. Oops, sorry. If I select it with the white arrow here, we can see there's just a box and it's got this pattern fill to it. If I open up swatches, notice here's that pattern fill. Again, you can read about pattern fills. I made it by creating a couple of bricks and offsetting them. And if I go into outline mode, you'll notice that there's 5 bricks here. I was trying to find a pattern. 5 bricks plus a background, a rectangle with a background and a fill. With a fill and a stroke of none. And with those guys in there, and this rectangle is sent all the way to the back, when you do that, you end up making a cropped repeating pattern. If I just select the larger bricks and I'll deselect this guy and I drag it into the swatches, notice what happens is it makes a really bad pattern swatch. If I apply it here, notice that the tiles get all jumbled up. So the way that you create a nice repeating tile is to put in a rectangle again with a fill and stroke of none. It sits behind everything else, and it defines the crop area of the pattern. So that's how I set up the brick pattern in the first place. I also made a brick and I wanted it to stand out against the background, so I did a special thing with appearance. I don't know if you fiddled around with appearance much, but you can add multiple strokes. Notice that there's multiple fills and strokes. I made a new stroke. I moved it behind the other fill and stroke, colored it white, gave it 4 points. If I move it forward, notice what it looks like. You'll see here. Obviously it's obstructing the other stroke and it's squishing in on the fill. So if you need just that space behind an object, that's an easy way of building it. Just build a stroke and put it behind everything else. So I made a couple of those objects for the top of the windows. For the bottom here, I actually built a gradient. So if we look at this gradient for a second, click away and click on it. I'm sorry, not a gradient, a blend. I'm sleepy, sorry. I made a blend and it has 3 steps in between. just between these two blocks. And then again, with that blend selected, I made a stroke, same 4-point stroke, and just put it behind everything. And that worked pretty well. So when you're building something, take into account the fastest way that you can put it together. Sometimes that's the way to do it. It might take a little longer to put it together initially, but it's going to give you a lot of flexibility. Okay, so anyway, we have this facade here. Now I want to anchor it to this object. So what I'm going to do is, the whole strategy here is it's grouped. I'm going to make a copy of this and just drag it up here to use it in the grid. But how do you get existing artwork into the perspective grid? I think that's a really fair question. So I want to get this onto the left side of the grid. So I'm going to click on the perspective tool, and there's a perspective selection tool. I'm going to first choose the left side of the grid, and then with this object selected, I'm just going to click and drag it. And I don't know if you can see in the movie, but you see an outline of the artwork. See, there's the artwork, and you can see the little blends there going underneath. So I'm going to just line this up against this edge. And when I drop it in, notice it does a fairly good job. But there's a problem. The obvious problem here is the pattern doesn't go into perspective. The pattern is still following the standard pattern we were using before. And that can be overcome. So what I'm going to do is undo that. And then I'm going to go under Object, and I'm going to choose Expand Appearance. And this gets rid of some appearance-oriented things. It expands them out. But then I'm also going to go under Object one more time and Expand. And when you do that, stuff like patterns get expanded out into objects. Just say OK here. Let's see. I wonder if we look at it in outline mode. Yeah, you can see in outline mode, all of those bricks now are showing up as individual items being clipped by a clipping mask. So that's what expand does. Now before I use this, I'm going to make another copy of it. I'm going to just Option drag it over here and kind of line it up. And then again, start with the left, get my perspective selection tool, make sure that the right part of the grid is selected, and just click and drag. And we'll just get this lined up. Doesn't really matter, but I'm going to just try to get these on the corner, and it's not critical. I mean, all you really need to do is get them to touch anyway. So we drop that in. You can see it takes a minute for it to update, but now all of those individual bricks do show up in the perspective. By the way, let's check a preference here. Yeah, this is interesting, and I suppose it's worth mentioning. Notice that Scale, Strokes, and Effects is turned on, but even with it on, in perspective, it's not making the strokes over here any smaller than the strokes over here. So the bricks are getting progressively chunkier as they're going off into the distance. So that must be just one issue or current problem with using the perspective tool, but I'll live with it. It's still pretty cool. Now we're going to work with the item on the right side. I'm going to get out the perspective tool again, the selection tool, and switch over to the right side of the grid here, and click and drag. Oops, sorry, but I had it selected. There we go. And I'm going to get this lined up on the side. We'll see if we can get it close. Yeah, pretty close. If I zoom in a little bit, we can look and see how close those bricks are, and they're pretty good. So this is a good way of being able to take a facade, something that's just frankly two-dimensional, and being able to put it into a three-dimensional kind of a look. Now obviously it's not a three-dimensional object. If you do a 3D object, if you use a program like Maya or AutoCAD, you can get a lot more strength in the design. But if you just need to create a goofy little facade, maybe put a sign in perspective, you know, we could imagine a little sign that would go on this. You can easily go about it here. So that's the first step. Now why don't we take a look at a one-point perspective instead. So I'll go ahead and let's undo this. Alright, and under the view, I'm going to just go under here to perspective grid, slide down to one-point perspective, choose that. With one point, you don't have a vanishing point to adjust. Well, you have one vanishing point, but it just stays kind of solid here. If I get out the perspective grid tool, notice that again I have the controls for moving that point up or down. If I want to have it look like we're looking overhead quite a bit and the thing's going to take a longer time to go into perspective, that would be more overhead. If we wanted to go at a low angle, so we're now down close to the ground, that would be more of a low angle. And then of course we can adjust where we want the wall edge to be. And we would just swing this around to the opposite side. So one-point perspectives are great if you're doing hallways, or I have a perfect example here. A one-point perspective gets used a lot when you're drawing something like a train track. So let's take a look at this train track that I built. Pretty straightforward. It's a group of items. I made two gradients that are just filling just from left to right, real basic setup. And then I just made two boxes. The box underneath is darker than the box on top, and that gives the appearance of fake dimensionality. You'll see this here in a second when we apply it to the grid. So I'm going to take this object or group of objects and just drag it up, and I'll make a copy of it again. And again, I recommend this just if you're working with the perspective tool, make a copy with the shapes you're dealing with. I think, at least for me, it's easier to experiment knowing that I've got the original sitting around somewhere. I'm going to just line this up and choose the perspective selection tool, and I'm going to drop it on the bottom plane here, and then just click and drag with that object selected, and you'll notice there's the train tracks going into space. And if you look carefully, you'll notice there's the same problem happening that we had before. The gradient is applied just flat like it was before, so it's still going just up and down. It's not following the rail as the rail gets converted into perspective. So it's just going up and down. So we're just going to do the same trick as we did before. We're going to expand the appearance on this. So I'll just undo this. And before we put it down, I'll just choose Object. And in this case, we don't have any appearance because I didn't use a blend when I made it. I didn't use anything special, any effects or any of that. So I'm just going straight to Expand. And again, if I go to outline mode, you'll notice what's happened, that those gradients have been converted into blends with distinct lines. I don't know if I can zoom in close enough where we'd actually see the lines. Yeah, you can't. We're zoomed in 6400%. Believe me, there's a bunch of little strokes there going from one side to the other, and that's how we're getting that gradient now. And again, expanding is great because it reduces your artwork down to its most basic form so that Illustrator can do stuff with it. So if you're ever having trouble like adding a brush or working with perspective grid, you can expand an object out. Now again, I like to keep the original object just in case I need to edit it for any reason. Once you've expanded it, you'd be hard pressed to edit these little rails and make it look good in any short amount of time. So that's why it's nice to have the original. But anyway, here we go. I'm going to click this item, and we'll throw it on the grid here. Sorry, just looking around for the tool. And as I lay it down, I get the nice little key blue line preview, and now we can kind of see how it works. And now you can see that since I expanded it, the gradients follow the rail as it goes back into space. And that little trick I did of just option copying the object below and just coloring it a darker color really works well for something like this, where you want to have it look like it's somewhat three-dimensional. It's just a trick to get it to look like that. And again, you can tell this is kind of more of a bird's eye view. If I want it to be more down at the angle of the rail itself, I can just manipulate this grid a little bit. Let me zoom back so I can grab these guys. Just going to take this and pull it down. Now I'll get out the perspective selection tool, click and drag, and now we're going to have something that looks a little more like we're down towards the ground. There you go. So that's it. The perspective grid tool, it's pretty slick. I mean, it does have some drawbacks, but boy, for what you can do with it, it's definitely a lifesaver, or at least a time saver. I guess one question that people have is, well, how can I get rid of this little widget? When you're working in the perspective grid tool, you can come up and click this little X, and that'll hide that, and it'll hide the grid too. So when you're done laying down the grid, that's how you go about it. So let me know if you have any questions, and hopefully this has been helpful to you. Sorry about the wait for it.